Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another NARSOL in action. It's kind of weird that we were here 3 months ago. It kind of feels longer, but in some aspects, it feels shorter. But do you know what? A lot of us are going to be together in person later this month, June 26th through 29th, in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And tonight for NARSOL in Action, as John Daw has already been putting in the chat, we do have a special for you. So if you can make it in person or if you can join us online, there is a 10% discount for either options and it's NIA 10. So go ahead, register. If I'm not mistaken, I think Dr. Chrysanthi Leon is going to be one of our keynote speakers. So you'll definitely want to come and hear her in Grand Rapids, Michigan. So I have the opportunity to come up with ideas for this show. And at times I run it by people, Brenda or others. And the reason I thought about this idea for this topic where we have Dr. Button and Dr. Leon, these are two amazing scholars. But the thing that puts them aside, in my opinion, from a lot of other professors is they have the audacity to teach classes around sexual offenses and just not like, oh, these people who commit these offenses are bad. No, it's looking at these offenses and punishment in a different way. And so there's a lot of people who are inside this movement who don't know about these classes. And so I was like, wow, we need to have a conversation with Dr. Button and with Dr. Leon about how they got into this work. And so thank you both for being here. And so tell us a little about yourself and your college experience.
So I guess I'll start. Thanks, Deanna. So I'm Chrysanthi Leon. Feel free to call me Santhi. And I do look forward to seeing many of you in Michigan in a couple weeks. My college experience, I started college a year early. I skipped eighth grade. So I was a very socially immature 17 when I started college. But I just was so excited to find my people. And I think that was my experience of college. I did. I found the other weirdos that had the same kinds of curiosity and passions that I had. And I got to spend 4 years. It was sort of the very idealistic, privileged liberal arts college experience. It was hard in a lot of ways too. I came from Southern California to the East Coast, and most of the other people had come from prep schools. So there was a very big class difference that I had to grapple with. And then it was, it was the mid 90s. I started college in 1995, and the world was not where I thought it should be in terms of my beliefs, in terms of gender and sexuality and politics more broadly. So I was the target of some pretty nasty bullying at times. I had a police escort for a while on campus. But I came out of it with clarity about what I believed in, what I wanted to do, and with a desire to play that role in terms of mentoring and research and teaching that I had seen. So yeah, that's me.
Thanks. My name is Deanna Button. So my college experience, I am a first generation college student. So first in my family to go to college at all, and then the only one so far to obtain my PhD. I grew up in a more disadvantaged background, so I started at a 2-year community college. And I think David wanted to chat later about how personal experiences kind of affect what we teach. So, growing up in a domestic violence alcoholic household, shaped getting into a 2-year because that's what I could afford and I didn't have help. And then I transferred to a 4-year, 8 hours away. And it was there that I started getting exposed to different political ideas, concepts like gender and social construction. So I worked a lot during college. I didn't kind of have the typical college experience, but it helps me relate to other students who are trying to figure out and navigate college as, without family that has that kind of know-how of financial aid and all that stuff.
Okay, well, thank you. I definitely love to hear the experiences that led you to college and really about those college experiences. So, what made you get interested in looking at sexual offenses?
You want to take this one first, Deanna? I think we should go back and forth on who goes
Okay.
first, if that's
Okay.
That'll
okay.
work. Y'all
Well,
can popcorn it back and forth.
all right, that sounds fair. So honestly, it was Dr. Leon. I did my PhD in criminology at the University of Delaware, and given my past family experiences, I wanted to understand victimization. I wanted to understand the causes, the correlates, the outcomes. So I went to the University of Delaware, who has many amazing scholars who are versed in gender studies and victimization studies. And I think it was Santhi's first year at University of Delaware as a faculty member. And she taught a class on sex offenders. And I went in there as a young, well, maybe not so young, mid-20s something, know-it-all. And I was like, how can you teach this? And like, but they're awful people. So I was one of those students who came to the table with these uninformed, narrow beliefs about the spectrum of offending and victimization. And it was through working with Santhi that I started to learn alternative views and efficacy of laws and fact-based knowledge of context of both victimization and the context of offending. And, the larger question of if we have this legislation and the goal is public safety, are we actually achieving that? Um, so that, sorry if my answer is too long, but that kind of opened up a door for me because I still claim victimologist as, one of my core academic identities. But with Santhi, I really learned that if we want to fully understand the gamut and the experience of victimization, we also have to understand the other side of the story and to explore the same kind of life course trajectories that lead people to these situations and the response that we as a society have to people who have committed crimes or had transgressions, looking more at a full person rather than a single event. And yeah, due process, I learned a lot about human rights and considering that. But yeah, that's my longer than typical answer.
Well, that's wonderful, Deanna. I'm reminded of so many things I had forgotten about you. It's really fun to kind of think back. And I think that's right. I think you were in the cohort the very first year that I came fresh out of grad school, also as a know-it-all in my way. So yeah, that's pretty great. So in terms of my interest in this area, as I mentioned, was raised in Southern California, and I'm a member of a Quaker meeting. And when I was I actually don't remember how old I was, maybe 12 or 13, a member of our meeting asked to have our meeting talk about having her son attend meeting with us after he left prison, having been convicted of a child sexual offense. And it was incredibly divisive. Still today, at least 35 years later, people don't talk to each other because of the argument that our Quaker meeting had about how to be a place of welcome for people who had experienced sexual violence as well as those who were perpetrators or had had time in prison related to sexual violence. And I just thought there's got to be a better way of talking about these issues and being willing to create that kind of space of welcome that we say we're about as a religious community. Yeah, so I was just sort of thinking, where are the experts on this? Who's talking about it? What can I do to understand more what's going on at the level of my community, but then also understanding it more broadly?
And that's one thing that I loved about the research that Maggie and you have done around the ways that churches receive individuals on the registry, persons forced to register, and how some are very receptive and welcoming, and others just want to create a 126-page safety manual that says you can't even like walk on our sidewalk. And so, if people want to learn more about that, they can definitely reach out to you. I think yeah, that's something that they can definitely chat with you about. And anybody
Still thinking about
who
it, still
is,
working on
yeah, I was gonna say Maggie is amazing. She's working on her PhD at UCI, so she's definitely somebody who would love you reaching out to too. So that would be great. So as you guys are creating these courses, what type of pushback was there, and how was it when you went to your chair and you're like, hey, um, I want to teach this class around sexual offenses and punishment, and how was that whole conversation, and was there any pushback?
I think it's my turn to go first.
Yes,
So
it
I will say
is.
I was really, really lucky because this was my main area of expertise. I had written my dissertation about it. I was planning in my first couple of years as a professor to turn that dissertation into a book, which I did. And so, because I was in a department that was eager to have me and wanted to keep me, they were willing to say yes to the things that I asked for. So, I asked to be able to teach that course in my area of expertise and got no pushback whatsoever. And I never have. I've been really fortunate. I think I've taught it 19 times. And I have always had a good experience. Even during the pandemic, I had a good experience teaching that course. There have been some interesting, bumps, but not in terms of pushback. It's always been something that was welcomed, and it's been a challenge I've really appreciated having the chance to deal with.
Oh, 19 times.
I
That
think so, yeah.
is incredible.
Yeah.
And
I
it's a
taught it in
class.
China once. That was really crazy.
Now,
It didn't work.
did you teach it in Mandarin
No,
or
but I had a member of the Communist Party sitting in the back of the room to make sure I didn't say anything that would get anybody into any trouble.
wow. That would have been one that I would have loved to have been there or watching on Zoom just to like see his reaction when you said something like, "No, don't like off with your head." It's like so Deanna.
So similar to Santhi, I've had a really great experience as far as administration goes, and with my program, which is basically the department. I'm in a criminal justice program, so people have deep knowledge of, the context of offenders and are versed in the evidence-based practices and stuff like that. So I didn't receive any pushback from my dean is also a criminal justice scholar, so I had a green light there. The other thing at Stockton University is we have a very robust general studies curriculum where you can teach any class, any topic that you want. So I teach my sexual assault class on victims and offenders in the general studies curriculum, which is really cool because I'm getting biology majors and health science majors and art majors. So I'm without any red tape, I'm able to expose a lot of students to these really cool ideas. Um,
Now I'm kind of curious because you're teaching in New Jersey. Dr. Leon is in Delaware. Some of my other colleagues that teach these classes are in Texas. What do you know of any scholars, any professors that teach these classes in like Tennessee or say Alabama or somewhere that is really deep in the Bible Belt or Southern that, there'd be a lot of pushback?
I don't know that there would be pushback. That's a really interesting question, though. Um, in terms of what I mentioned doing my research that I turned into my first book, I actually found that the states in the South, if not the Bible Belt, were in some ways more open to quiet efforts to make more reasonable laws. I mean, and this is not contemporary. I haven't updated it, but I think that, they might not sort of publicize it or talk about it in some of the ways that other places would, but, they're taking a look at what the research tells us can appeal to people regardless of their political orientation, and it can also not, right? So, yeah, I think it's a question that's probably stickier than we assume, but it's actually a great research question too, is to find out how many courses like ours are taught and what they're like in different places, maybe by looking at the syllabi.
So let's get a grant. I'm city certified, and let's do a research
I
together.
I am mid-career and looking for a new research agenda, so sign me up.
Hey, no, no kidding at all. I think we could
One
totally do this.
One of the things that, when thinking about the pushback, I don't get it from administrators or colleagues who are also experts in criminal justice, but I have received pushback from students in the class. So that's an area, and again, modeling kind of how Santhi taught me, I often try to tease out what are our social values. And I'm not trying to tell them what their personal values should be, but we are taking a critical look at the social world we live in and what does the research say about the efficacy of laws and policies? Do they actually work if the goal is increasing public safety and or if the goal is reintegration? So students from a variety of perspectives, when I first started teaching initially, and I didn't, tease out social values and your own personal values and what does the research say, I received a lot of pushback. But now I'm very intentional in saying, I'm not trying to tell you what your value should be, but I do expect you to know what the research says. And that has kind of paved a way to where they're more receptive.
Okay.
That even though I didn't get any pushback in terms of being able to teach the class, I did not have the experience that Deanna has of having colleagues who were at least conversant in the areas. I had a number of colleagues in my first couple of years who were very surprised by the research, for example, on recidivism that I shared with them. And I also had several colleagues, most of whom have retired now, but not all have, who told incoming graduate students not to work with me because I was a perpetrator side person. I didn't understand victims' issues. And I will say, I do think that I have gotten better about talking about being a survivor of sexual violence and about victimology issues, in part because of working with Deanna and other people early on in my career. I don't think I was very good at it. So I think that's part of that pushback was of my own creation. But still to this day, there are people who, again, discourage students from working with me because of what I do.
That's
Okay.
a shame. That's a shame.
Yes, it definitely is. So we're going to put the questions I have on hold because we have two questions in the chat. So the first is from John Daw, and he said, what would be your first steps to begin changing widespread public opinion to evidence-based information/practices?
You go for it.
That's the big question, right, John? Yeah, that's what I've been thinking about and struggling with for probably 25 years. And I initially became in contact with NARSOL, previously RSOL, and some of the previous iterations, because I wanted to hear what people directly impacted were talking about, and because I was so moved by encountering people who were loved ones of people on the registry. And so I have found that a combination of here's what the research shows and personal stories that allow people to see ourselves in other people has been the most effective in reaching students. The bigger question in terms of public policy change, that's the big one. I mean, I think we're making really important incremental change through the efforts of NARSOL and others who work in these areas. So I feel confident we're going to get there. I actually, I'm eager to talk to people at the upcoming conference about whether we think the Trump administration might be more amenable to fostering an environment that looks at the kinds of reforms we're interested in than the Biden administration, which had its own it brought its own stuff with it in terms of protecting children and that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's a great question, but all I can do is kind of go back and forth between research, storytelling, and again, creating space for people to see themselves in others' experiences.
Yeah, I do. I think, again, coming from the victimology centered lens and pulling in the offender perspective in the context of that, I often find that factual knowledge about sexual assault, regardless of if it's about the victim, if it's about the offender, or if it's about the assault, right? Like ideas of what counts as assault, of what doesn't, of who would or who wouldn't ever harm someone, what victim behavior should be like post-assault, years after the assault. Starting conversations with just factual information about sexual assault in our culture starts to shift the way they think because our society, living in the rape culture, we have such a narrow definition of what counts as rape. And many people will push away their experiences on either side of the dichotomy. If we start with a foundation of, actually, I could go on about this all night. I won't, but like, what is consent, right? We talk about what rape is and what you're not supposed to do, but we have very limited knowledge from early on to, people in their 40s and 50s. What does consent entail? And if we lived in a culture, for me, my humble opinion is that if we focus more on what do we do to have healthy relationships and healthy boundaries, and how do we respect one another, and how do we assert ourselves in that, that could lay a different foundation of how we talk about sexual assault and public opinion of how to handle discretions or, offenses.
So we are definitely gonna have to talk to the powers that be and work on having you come speak in 2026 at our conference.
Would be amazing.
So our other question from the audience is, does your curriculum include offenders and victims of all types of sex crimes or just sexual assault? I'd be interested to see if you provide research on pornography and luring offenses. And this was from Anya.
So specifically, pornography kind of comes up through different units in my class. But in my syllabus, I kind of talk about what the definition of sexual assault is, and then we talk about child sexual victimization, LGBTQ specific victimization. I bring in race, and those conversations more focus on how society responds to both victims of the various forms of sexual assault and perpetrators who commit those crimes or transgressions. I try to cover more, but one of the biggest challenges of teaching a course on victims and offenders is being able to lay a foundation that's theoretical and for them to apply the real life everyday experiences. Like, how does the social construction of gender shape our understanding of who a victim is and who a offender is? How does our social construction of sexuality shape what is permissible and what is not? I'm not sure if that really answered the question, but.
Yeah, that definitely answered the question. Chrysanthi?
Yeah, so similar to Deanna, although I'm not in a criminal justice department, I'm in a sociology and criminal justice department. So it's already interdisciplinary in that way. And then I cross-list my course with our women and gender studies department. So it brings in those students as well. And I also teach it it meets one of the university's requirements for seniors. So I occasionally get a biology student. I get a lot of business majors. It's not nearly as broad in its reach as Deanna's, but I do really enjoy having those perspectives. But I make it really clear at the beginning of the class that this is not abnormal psych. I'm not going to tell them about deviance, and I'm not going to titillate them with case files and stuff like that. That I'm a sociologist primarily, and that I'm interested in what does it mean that these are the things we have against the law and that we punish them that way? And what, again, as Deanna has talked about, like, where are we starting from in terms of our assumptions and what does the research say about them? So I don't cover the gamut of things that can be counted as sex offenses or as sexual violence. And I often am pretty current events driven, right? So I will include, things that are happening in terms of prominent people who are accused of things. Sometimes I include things actually happening on our campus, and sometimes I don't. And it's always a hard call to make in terms of what the risks are of talking about something that might be so proximate to people who might have experienced or be a friend with someone who's either the perpetrator or the victim. But I try to keep it flexible in terms of what I actually cover, and I focus more on what are the key things I want students to leave this class with. I'm also lucky that it's a small class of 25. It's capped at that. It can't be any more than that. So it's really discussion based. And so I'm even more interested in getting students to be willing to talk to each other about these issues than I am about covering specific descriptive content.
That actually leads in perfectly to the next question I have. And so I want you to share with us, both of you, what the thoughts are of the students when they come into your class. What kind of fears, hesitations they have. And then how have they evolved or changed or shifted after the semester of learning about sexual offenses, learning about victimization, learning about individuals who commit a sexual offense?
I can't remember whose turn it is.
I think it might be mine.
Yes, it
I wrote
is.
notes on this one. So let's see. I think students are afraid that it might be graphic. I think part of them also kind of hopes it is. Like I mentioned the titillating aspect before. I think part of one of the thick, uglier sides of our culture is that we like to consume sensational, violent stories, specifically sexual violence. So again, as I try to disabuse them of that at the beginning, this is not what that class is going to be. And I also let them know that I'll provide content warnings wherever I can, but that, I cannot predict what will bring something up for someone else in terms of response or anything else along those lines, and that I welcome them telling me if I've made a mistake and not warned them or sort of prepped them for something they shouldn't otherwise. So that's how I manage that concern. In terms of what they bring to it, they tend to, as you won't be surprised to hear, have a very pathologizing approach. So one of the main things I hammer home over the course of the class is that it is really comforting for us to think about people who perpetrate sexual violence as being psychologically disordered or other in some kind of way. And that actually serves social purposes for us, right? It allows us to build a sense of solidarity among the people on one side versus the other. And so we talk about that a great deal. And I think I mostly get most of them there by the end of the class in separating from that idea of pathologizing. Because the research is really quite clear on how rare it is for someone to have a sexual psychopathy or something along those lines. So I think I get them on that pretty well. They're also surprised about recidivism and that kind of stuff. The other piece that I've really emphasized over recent years is looking at how what we do in the criminal justice system concentrates disadvantage. And so thinking about the intersections between being on the registry and being a person of color, being on the registry and having experienced homelessness, sort of all those kinds of things. Because again, our media image of who a sex offender is tends to be really limited, right? As we all know, everybody who's here, I can't see all your faces here, but I know you know this better than anybody. So I spend a lot of time kind of, again, trying to, I don't like the word humanize because we're already human anyway. We don't need to be humanized, but there is a sense in which we do need to be reminded of the humanity of everybody that we're talking about. And so that's what I just keep coming back to.
Yeah, and my class is again split between the victims and offenders, so I kind of do a bait and switch with them. I start with victims and it's not a hard sell of let's look at the impact of these experiences on their trajectory. Let's look at how society responds to victims. As with perpetrators, the criminal justice response is not ideal. And then I get them, having a better understanding of victim responses immediately and years later. And then we start talking about the perpetrators. And they're, as Santhi said, they think that they're these, boogeymen who come out of the woods, your myth of the black male stranger rapist. And we talk a lot about factual data of who the typical sex offender is. And it's not child predators. A lot of times child abuse is out of convenience in the context to that. And I spend a lot of time, like Santhi does, focusing on how we try to pathologize and we try to say, it's a psychological issue, and psychology absolutely plays a role. But as a sociologist, I focus on how does the culture and our understanding of concepts of consent and sexual offense and masculinity influence the experiences on both the victim and the perpetrator side. So students will come in, and even at the end, I have to catch them because they'll answer a question and they'll be like, yeah, that guy's messed up, or, like, these are the worst types of sex offenders. And I'm like, they're also the rarest. They're also the least common. They are sensationalized. Murder and rape very rarely go together. So I just keep, again, pushing factual information, and eventually they start to catch themselves too. It's a really neat process watching them deeply ingrained factual or non-factual information and how they start to catch it themselves as they're speaking, like the rape myths, really.
Yeah, so thank you for answering that and really taking us on that journey that the students have when they come in and where they're thinking and how they leave the course. The next question is going to be about lived experience, and the type of individuals that you bring in as guest speakers. Now, I would have to say that I have been blessed to speak in both of your classes. I think I've spoken Santi's like 3 times in this class. And so I met Santi back in 2018 when I was working at, I think it was 2018 when I was working at New Person Ministries in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And I came across your work. And I am going to say that Santi had the students write questions beforehand that I could have to get a gauge as far as what they were going to ask. And I'm going to tell you that these students didn't ask just like basic questions. These were well thought out, well prepared questions. And I think I only spent like 5 or 8 minutes talking about my story before we began to jump into these questions. And that showed me the way that she prepared the students, and that it wasn't just like surface issue things. These were really deep conversations that they were having in the classes. And so I enjoyed both of your classes and just the conversations with the students. So how important is it to bring people with lived experience into your classes? It's your turn, Deanna.
Okay. So you are actually one of the first guest speakers that has been able to share lived experience as someone who's been formerly incarcerated. A lot of times victims will share their like people with prior victimization experiences in the class will share their experiences. And even when we get to the offender side of the content, they will relate to how having had a former experience with this and the response that people had to the perpetrator of whether or not that helped them healing their emotional journey with justice or with safety. So we don't always get direct experiences from students who have been on or who have engaged in perpetration of sexual offenses. But the students who have experienced sexual victimization themselves will give very thoughtful, crafted answers about what they wish would have happened in comparison to what did happen and the additional harm that it caused both victim and offender.
Yeah. So are you still there? I feel like things went
Yeah, we
quiet.
are here.
Yeah, cool. All right. So lived experience is crucial to my class. I think going back and forth, as I've said, between research and storytelling is really important. But I try to be thoughtful about it every time I teach the class, and I adjust to who I happen to have in the class and things that are going on. But no matter what I'm teaching, whether it's this class or anything else, I point out in the very first day of class that we can't assume that people don't have lived experience who are sitting in the room, right? And in fact, we should assume that most, if not everybody in the room, has lived experience with sexual violence, with someone who has experienced it as a survivor, as a perpetrator, with someone who works in the criminal legal system, all that kind of stuff. Just reminding ourselves of that proximity is something I do at the very beginning and I do throughout the class, because it again is part of the strategy of getting us away from distancing and othering that we do. And then I've been really fortunate to have local folks who will come in and talk about various things. So I always have somebody who's experienced the registry speak to the class at some point. Sometimes it's somebody in my class. Like I didn't know one semester until about halfway through that one of the students enrolled was himself on the registry. It was a total surprise to me. And we talked through afterwards why he made the choice to wait until that point to share it with me. And then we decided that since he really wanted to tell his story with his fellow students, that we would wait till the end of the class to do that, for a number of reasons that made sense for him and for the class. And so that was probably the most powerful. I'm also fortunate to have a chapter of NARSOL. The Delaware chapter is here and easy to access. So their folks come often to the class. In terms of lived experience, I also try to really mix up the kinds of things that we read and listen to and do. So there's so many great podcasts now that are available. That's something I didn't have access to early on in my teaching, but we have those that we listen to and can talk about together. There's a great article that I use about a person who's given the pseudonym of Bella, and she writes about the experience of what she calls having been groomed by her coach, who was I think a swimming coach. And it's an article that's an academic article, but it's non-traditional in that it's mostly Bella's words. And I love that because so many of my students have athletic experience. And so they can really think about coaching as a specific relationship that creates space for intimacy in so many great ways, but that also can be manipulative and other kinds of things. And so those are the kinds of ways. So even if I don't have people coming in person to talk about lived experience, I'm really sensitive to trying to bring in as many of those perspectives as I can. I'm
Yeah.
not so good at cross-cultural. I would love to have more people come in and talk about their experiences in specific racial and ethnic communities. We don't have great research on that either, at least from my perspective. And I also, as a white woman, I feel a certain reluctance to, reach out to specific communities and say, do you have somebody who will come and talk about this thing? So if there are folks on this call who would like to give me advice about that, I would welcome it.
Yeah, I also use documentaries where I can, and that helps too. And one thing that like one strategy that students really respond to is I'll show them a documentary about lived experiences of sexual offenders and then show them like a film that's more, Hollywood sensationalized, and we'll analyze based on what we know about the research. How does the documentary, how is it consistent, and how is the film, for entertainment purposes consistent, and in what ways is it not? And that really gets them thinking about what information have they consumed that's readily available. So we do kind of lived experiences, whether they're fictional or non-fictional too.
So just jumping to one of the questions in the chat real quickly. Do you ever do this class online? And if so, can somebody audit it? And that was from Gus.
I hate online. So I learned how to do it okay during the pandemic. And I recognize that it is, in terms of accessibility, a really good thing that we have in higher ed, but it makes my head hurt and I'm not good at it. So in fact, doing this Zoom is like a little at the edge of my comfort. Um, so no, but I totally take the point that in terms of accessibility, it would be a great idea to do so. And it's actually quite easy at the University of Delaware to take classes if you're not a full-time student. And that's the case for most public institutions. So if you're somebody who would like to just take a class, I encourage you to look into how actually pretty easy it is to do in most places. How about you, Deanna? How do you do with online?
I feel similarly about online. It would make my work-life balance much better, but I really I don't enjoy it as much. But I'm wondering, given that this is an audience-driven conversation, I wonder if that's because in much of the online teaching I've done, it's with students who are forced to be there and are a bit disengaged. So I'm not against exploring that. I don't think I would want to teach it as like a college course that people get college credit for, but a community, reading group or something like that. I would, as long as it's family friendly times, I would be open to it.
Well, that makes me think that, maybe we could get both of you back on, not in a NARSOL in action, but another spin-off type thing where we can just go through just a quick example of what's in your classes, and kind of break it more down where you're talking about the data, you're talking about different stories, and really how you shape the whole conversation for the students.
And I'm happy to share current or former syllabi. I think Santhi's work is much more focused on the offender side. But if anybody wants to reach out, I can drop my email in the chat and just kind of share a reading list too.
Yeah, because somebody did say that they'd love to reach out to you. So we can definitely, if we don't, John Dodd, do you mind go ahead and putting Santhi's and Deanna's email in the chat for those listening? And yes, I mean, really, somebody put in the chat that many are prevented from school or there are barriers, and really, when you think about colleges and universities, it's one of those things that is very iffy depending on where you are. when I was at New Person Ministries, I had more success talking to the Christian university about taking in our residents than the state college. And that really blew my mind. I'm like, wait, this Christian university that's smaller isn't going to have problems taking our residents in as students, but the state university, you have to go through 25 hoops and then some hurdles and this. And I'm like, wow, I just sat there and left scratching my head, and I was like, wow, this is crazy. um but so the next question I is, have these classes led to students getting involved in the research or researching with you? And, I'd love to hear about those stories. And I think it's you, Deanna.
Okay, so I have an N of one. Before we started our live recorded feed, Santhi and I were talking about one of my students who is graduating with an undergrad degree at Stockton University and will be starting her PhD working with Santhi in the fall. So she emailed me a year before I had her in class and was like, I know that you do this type of work. I want to work with you. And I was like, dude, I have two little kids. No. So she came into class and took the sexual assault class with me and kind of pulled me out of a mid-career slump. And we started this really cool research project about sexual assault and looking at responses, primarily on victims. But, it was a really fulfilling and kind of career enlivening experience to have a student who just asked so many questions and was just open to learning and taking feedback and being at the brink of a fork in the road of, does she want to go into psychology or does she want to go into criminology and academia and learn more and get the word out there about what factual experiences are. And I'm really excited for her. I hope to have the opportunity again.
And I know that you definitely will.
I hope.
Yeah, I've been really fortunate because we're at a four-year university and I get to teach my class in their senior year, although I do have a couple of junior students. I'm pretty likely to have students that go on and use this work in some way. So I've done summer research projects with a number of students. At least one student wrote her undergraduate thesis related to things we talked about in my class. David's mentioned Maggie, who was a fantastic undergrad with me, who's gone on to work in a doctoral program on this issue. But the coolest thing I have to say is that one of my students, while she was an undergrad in my class, wrote a young adult fiction book called Revenge of the Sluts that was published and that is about the things we talk about in my class. And I'm a thinly veiled character in it, which is so cool.
That is so cool.
Yes.
Wow, that is amazing. I did not know that, and it's definitely kind of cool. And hearing that title, it just made me think about Revenge of the Nerds, and I'm like
Exactly.
taken back to like just that whole like
Yes, it is
wow.
probably not for this audience because it's about high school students and about how they're kind of negotiating sexuality and thinking about sexting and that kind of stuff. But I've actually taught it in that class since, and it really very much speaks to the 20-year-olds, 21, 22-year-olds who are taking it.
I mean, it definitely does, because there's a lot of time when I'm speaking in universities, and especially here in Pennsylvania, I talk about the aspect of um just indecent exposure and how easy it is to be convicted of that, and now you're on the registry for 15 years as a tier 1 registrant, and then I talk about sexting, and a lot of these students don't realize how easy it is to end up on the registry for sexting, and that the laws that we have in place now that were put into place 30, 40 years ago weren't thought about in regards to sexting and other things like that. And so there definitely has to be a lot of changes, a lot of conversations around things like that. Um, so how can more schools have classes like this? Do we have to clone each one of you and like send you all over the country?
I feel like you should get my husband's opinion on that first. Um, is it my turn?
No, I think it's Santi's.
Um, okay, Santi, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Well, I will say I have I don't know, I feel ambivalent, right? Um, I have thought about putting together a textbook, or if not a textbook, then like a publicly accessible website where people could access some of the things that I teach. And I might do that. Um, but as I mentioned, I spend a lot of time building community and a sense of comfort in discussing these issues. And so the one time I tried to translate this into an online training, it just didn't work. It's really not my skill set, right? So I think I'm good at meeting people as individuals and talking to them and listening to them and kind of working through some of the issues that we all care about. But I think scaling it up is probably not my thing. And I would be concerned about sort of putting out a syllabus of things that I suggested people read, because it's the conversation we have about it that is so much more important, I have found, in the ability to see the humanity in each other than just the content itself. I do think that it's worth looking at how many of these kinds of courses are being taught, and if there is a space for creating something, or for maybe NARSOL creating some materials that could be used in this kind of thing. Um, but I just think that most likely they're going to be in criminal justice departments that are more like cop shops, which means they're about preparing people to work in law enforcement. And so they're much more focused on the practice of policing than they are on the issues that I'm interested in. I mean, that stuff's really important too, but it's just not what I'm interested in. And similarly, I think psychology departments approach this topic with a very abnormal psych approach, as I mentioned. And I don't think that they have the orientation towards recognizing empathy and those kinds of things either, when they're used to having that sort of clinical deviance kind of perspective. But I hope maybe I'm wrong, and maybe there are spaces where that there could be more of this offered if there were better resources out there. So I really do think that's something we should look at.
Yeah, so my humble opinion is the sneak attack. Again, I think this content could be built in. Again, you have to have scholars who are knowledgeable about it, and it's their area of expertise. But I find at the end of my semester, students repeatedly say, "Why isn't this class mandatory?" And I'm like, "Hey, take it to the administration, right? Like, send them an email, and let them know." I think one of the really great things about Stockton is the general studies curriculum. So, as Santhi mentioned, one of the strengths, one of the limitations is a lot of this content is covered in criminal justice, and usually from a criminal justice practitioner side. But my brilliant idea, if I had all the time and support in the world, would be to couch classes like this in consent and talking about a culture of consent versus a rape culture. And that just allows us a really big umbrella to start tackling how do we get from sex that is wanted and consensual to sex that is not, sex that is traumatic, sex that occurs when the perpetrator is completely bewildered when they're accused of rape, right? Like, how does this happen? And it happens so often, particularly on college campuses. They're like, I didn't rape that girl. I had sex with her. Yeah, she said no, but, right? Like, how do we get there? I'm not going to argue that it's psychopathology or this one person who's so messed up or deviant, or it's just because they have, this history of abuse or something like that. There's a bigger picture there. And that to me is the sociological foundation. So when you couch this content in a broader umbrella of whether it's victimology, whether it's consent, whether it's sexual health, I think that opens the door. Now, how to make that happen, I'm not sure, but.
Well, we definitely have some things to look into and see how many professors are out there. Like I said, I know a couple of different professors. Like I know uh, professor at TCU. I know two professors at UT Tyler and some others doing stuff around this. So we can definitely have a conversation and kind of look to see like where there's openings and individuals that would be interested in doing something like this. So one of the questions, those are all of my questions. So we have about 10 minutes left. So if you have any more questions, go ahead and put them in the Q&A spot. We have one here from Teresa Bond that says, have you had any situations with false allegations and the one making the false allegation attended your class? How would they understand what they did was wrong? Maybe how to make it right?
So I don't know if this directly relates to what Teresa is saying, but this past semester, I had a student who told me that she was accused of sexual assault, and she said it was a false accusation. And then we had this huge, meaningful, very brave conversation about what consent is. And after, in front of the whole class, she was like, "Oh my God, you just redefined an experience, a reality, a lifetime." Um, we talk a lot too about false allegations and how lying about rape is essentially the number one rape myth, right? And then how does our understanding of consent muddy those waters of what is a false allegation versus an actual experience? I don't know. I feel like this might be a political answer, but Santhi, do you want to jump in?
No, I think you held it really well. I was just going to say, there's a great book out called Sexual Citizens, and it includes interviews and stories from people about the kinds of experiences you're recounting, Deanna, and that young people, it focuses on college age people, on how young people talk about what they have done and what they have experienced, and how that can shift as in terms of their thinking around consent and those kinds of things. And just to reiterate, it's absolutely the case that in terms of what we can measure and what we have measured, false accusation, unfounded accusations are a lot more rare than we think. It's one of those things we tend to think is out there. Not to say that they're not incredibly harmful when they happen. And we do talk about power imbalances and all the things that kind of lead to that. Yeah, so it's just messy and difficult. Luckily, I have not had the experience of having that come out in my class.
Yeah. What was interesting about that, though, was that it was a female student. I very rarely get men in my class, particularly cisgendered heterosexual men, but it was a really cool moment for her to
Mm.
think so deeply about behavior, about common understandings, about again, because when we live in a culture that defines this is what you're not supposed to do, and it's so narrowly defined, that leaves our young people with an absence of, well, what does healthy behavior look like? And what about X? And what about Y? And what about Z? So there's not a ton of literature out there, but the consent literature, I really think is an avenue that should be explored when thinking about how to respond to sexual violence.
And I think you brought up another good point too, that, the person that was being accused of this was a female, and this is a thought that, a lot of people don't really think about it. I mean, when society says the term sex offender, they think it's a 40 to 65-year-old white male that has molested a 8 to 14-year-old girl. That is what society has ingrained in our minds. So thinking about it as being a female, it kind of makes you think too. I mean, that's the thing that I've loved the past couple years about seeing the Shine group and more women who are on the registry coming to the conferences, getting involved, and sharing their story, because this is a population that has been silenced for so long and they didn't feel like they had a voice, and they didn't feel like they belonged. So I think it's really important that this population is saying, yes, my voice matters, my story matters, and I'm going through the same experience as you are, and actually being looked at in a different way. So I think that's really important too.
Yeah, I had a kind of, if I can share very briefly, I had
Go
a
ahead.
student who I think this is a generational trend kind of thing. So our young people are much more likely to identify as non-binary or bisexual than being boxed into the traditional dichotomies of either heterosexual or gay or man or woman. And what I noticed the young people talking about is I don't know if this is taboo, I hope not, but like group sex and the dynamics of group sex and consent surrounding that. So one student shared, I don't know if it was a secondhand story or personal involvement, but three people were engaging in sexual activity, and then the third person later said, well, that was rape, it wasn't consensual, and unpacking all of the myths of, well, we've done this before, and well, we weren't drunk, we were drunk, right? Like all of these, how do we define what is consent, what is not, what is sexual assault? And all of those definitions are the foundation or the bedrock of what a false accusation would be, you know, from a very sociological, not so much criminal justice perspective.
I think that kind of goes in kind of perfectly to the next question. Actually, let's look at this. So the first question I asked, as far as the person that made the false accusation, the person was talking about there's a married couple going through the divorce. The wife accused the soon-to-be ex of assault and had him sent to prison to keep him away from his child. So that gives a little background there. But this other question kind of goes into the thought process about what you just were talking about, and is, are you seeing changes in viewpoints in the younger generation who have greater access to pornography at a younger age?
I don't know if the changes I'm seeing are related to views of pornography. Um, I do think the internet, so they are kind of exposed to more sociological concepts of social construction of gender and have better knowledge of rape myths compared to 30 years ago. I see more individualism, and I don't know if this is really going to relate to it, but like you are allowed to do whatever you want to do, regardless of the well-being of community or family or something like that. I see differences in their willingness to share very personal experiences quickly. So things that were taboo even 5 years ago, they're more willing to speak about. But I don't know if it's particularly connected to pornography.
Yeah, what I see and what I am most excited about in terms of the changes I've seen over the years is that students are much more comfortable talking about mental health issues and well-being and all kinds of things around what it means to be a healthy person. And part of that means speaking up in terms of when people violate your boundaries or asking people about their boundaries, all of that kind of thing. And so it might not seem like it's directly related, but I do think that the willingness to talk about feelings, honestly, is something that is something the newer generations, the younger generations are better at than some of the rest of us. So I appreciate that. And I think that can only be for the good. In terms of pornography, it's much easier for me to talk about it in class in 2025 than it was when I started in 2006. Because people are just much more comfortable with it as an aspect that's easily accessible to everybody. And I think that's probably good in that the less things that are taboo, the fewer things that are taboo, the better, just generally. And so we can have conversations about commercially exploitative materials, and we can have conversations about agency and about, how people's sexual scripts change over time, stuff like that, that I think is really helpful to people's being healthy members of society and of relationships. So I don't see a direct link like Deanna does either, but I do think that it's going to be interesting to see how subsequent generations who did grow up with a very different sense of their sexuality because of that easy access to all kinds of different pornographies. Like we just have a lot to learn about how that's going to play out.
Thank you guys for those answers. We have one last question, if it doesn't keep moving. So what efforts have been made to differentiate personal attacks versus online offenses? Some therapists was told that online offenders can have a very low recidivism rate with therapy and group meetings, while a serial personal attacker can't be modified.
Well, again, in terms of what we know, in terms of the data we collect, it is the case that there is a very small group of people who commit serial stranger rape who have fairly high recidivism rates. And that's not the case for nearly everybody else who might have to register or who might be a perpetrator of some kind of sexual harm or violence. So there is that very small group. I'm sure there probably are some differences between online and in person more broadly. That's not something I've looked at recently, but if the person who shared that question wants to follow up with me, I'm happy to do a little digging and follow up on that.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add. That's a little beyond my knowledge scope.
So Richard, you can definitely reach out to Dr. Leon, and also if you're going to be in Michigan later
Yeah,
this
just come
month,
have
you can
lunch with me.
talk in person, you know? And so I want to take this time to thank both you, Dr. Button and Dr. Leon, for being on here. I hope that everybody is listening was able to take a lot from this. I know that there will probably be people who will be listening to this and watching it in the next couple of days because they couldn't make it tonight. But I definitely appreciate both of you. I love the classes that you guys are teaching and how you're educating the next generation and challenging their thoughts when they come in with one mindset and they leave with a different mindset, or have a different thought process around sexual offenses and those who commit these type of offenses. So thank you so much for that. Those of you who are going to be in Grand Rapids in a couple of weeks, let's get ready to listen to Dr. Leon and the keynote that she's going to bring. Those of you who would love to see Dr. Button at 2020 or 2026 conference, go ahead, get off this call, send Brenda 1,000 emails and say, we need her to come and speak in 2026, and we will make it happen. So thank you all for coming out tonight for NARSOL in Action. And we look forward to seeing you in a couple months again. And we look forward to seeing you in 3 weeks in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Y'all have a great night.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.